It's spinning. All right. Well, welcome to Lessons in Leadership. My name is Dana Williams, and I'm here with my buddies H and Micah. H has a little raspy throat today, so we're calling him different names today. Is it Kermit?
Kermit the Frog.
we,
Very
we
white.
have yeah. We don't know. We've got different
It
names for H.
depends on how raspy I get.
He's got a little sinus infection, but he's dedicated, so he's here today. So thank you, H. Again, we have doing these every other week on LinkedIn Live, sharing our practical experience as CliftonStrengths coaches, facilitators, consultants, and using real life experience to help you, whether you're a leader, a coach, entrepreneur, or founder. We're just glad you're here. And my business is about helping leaders and entrepreneurs transform their lives from the inside out. And I start with strengths and then work on their branding and work on their mission, and we go from there. So it's pretty exciting to see the results and to see people transforming their lives and their companies. So I'm going to kick it over to Micah, and he's going to introduce himself, and then he'll kick it over to H. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dana. My name is Micah Lawrence. I am an ICF certified coach and a Gallup certified strengths coach. And I do mostly leadership coaching with startup founders and small business owners and team development workshops with their teams. I'll hand it over to H. I have some thoughts already that I was going to jump into, but we'll give H an opportunity to introduce himself.
Hey, I'm H. That's my first initial. My last name is Muir. Everyone calls me H. My business, I work with organizations, brands, teams, and leaders on development with a variety of ways to do that. But Strength Finders is one of those. What we're going to talk about in the session, it's our last, have we done 4, right?
We've done 4.
This is our 4th.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is our last, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to make sure everybody knows, please write your comments in the section on the side, and we'll see them and respond as we see you write your comments. And then also we're going to try to go about 25 minutes today. So Micah's going to be jumping off a little bit ahead of that. So if you see him jump off, he's not being rude. He just has another speaking engagement. So anyway, just wanted to set the ground there. I forgot to do that. So over to you,
good.
H.
Yeah. So we've been talking about, for each domain, how do you leverage your strengths in that domain to meet the needs of followers? And there's 4 needs of followers, and Dana's going to talk about those. Just want to refresh people about the 4 domains. And we use the RISE model. So the RISE model is about relationship building, influence, strategic thinking, and execution. And we do that. I do that in my team development and actually working with leaders on collaboration, because I think there's a flow to that. That if you want to execute, you can't execute unless you have the right strategy. You don't get the right strategy, which at its simplest in a collaboration strategy is about decision making. You don't make the right decisions unless you have the right information and or influencing, and you don't influence or get the right information if you're not have trust in relationships. People don't show up and bring their full self and their information to it. So that's why we do it in this order. So we're going to talk about the execution domain today. And Dana's going to tell us about the 4 needs of leaders or followers. Sorry.
Yeah. So right now, as you guys know, we're going in through the great reshuffle, the great transformation, a lot going on, and leaders are really interested in retaining their people and attracting new people. And so one of the things we're using is Gallup's research on the 4 needs of followers for leaders to think about when they're communicating and influencing and working with their teams. And so the first need of follower is trust. And we always want to start with trust. And what does that look like? And what does that feel like? And it depends on the leader's particular strengths. And then we get into compassion and how does a leader listen and aware. I think one of the things today is, even in our relationship personally as well as business, we just don't give our full attention. And so that compassion to listen and to be there for them and understand. And then stability. What is the stability we're offering our teammates, our team? How are we showing them stability? How are we pointing to stability? And the last is hope, inspiring them, giving that vision of where we're going. So those are the 4 needs of followers. And I just went through those very quickly. You can always go to Gallup.com and type in 4 needs of followers and see it in depth of that. but we're going to be talking about how those 4 needs of followers relate to these domains, and especially the executing domain today. So I'm going to kick it off back to H or Micah to carry that.
Well, one of the things I was going to talk about, or just quickly remind people what the strengths are in the execution domain, and they are achiever, arranger, belief, consistency, deliberative, discipline, focus, responsibility, and restorative. Yes, I had to read those because I only have one in my top 10.
I haven't memorized them all either, if that makes you feel better, in each domain.
Yes.
So when we talk about something like the executing domain, actually, that's interesting. Dana, do you have executing strengths in your top 10? What do you have?
I do. All of mine are 6 through 10. So I
don't have any in my top 10 either.
So my top 5 are all strategic thinking, and I get things done in my 6 through 10. So it's the achiever, the belief, the responsibility, the arranger. I have all of those. Yeah.
Mine comes in, my executing domain come in at like 12, 13, and 14. So it's up there. So I still know how to get stuff done, but it's not what I lead with. So just as for people who are new to this and maybe aren't familiar with the executing domain, it might be helpful just to remind people that there are people out there that are productivity minded. They like getting things done. They like seeing progress made. They have a lot of stamina to work hard, and the execution domain. I love to compare this with the strategic thinking domain. From the very first time that I took the training, somebody made this distinction. Right, it was my trainer that made the distinction between people in the strategic thinking domain and in the executing domain differ in what they consider getting work done. And when executors are checking things off their list, it's like they can see work getting done. They can check it off their list. They can show metrics or show evidence that work has been completed. Whereas strategic thinking people will think about something and that's on their to-do list. To them, thinking is doing, but to people in the execution domain, doing is doing. And that's a distinction that they would make themselves. Any other thoughts about the execution domain that would help people know how to observe this?
I have. So as I looked at the execution domains, as I break them down, right, I think of kind of the 3 Ps, where it's some people get stuff done because it's a priority. That would be achievers, responsibility. Some people get things done because they use a process. That would be consistency, deliberative, probably discipline. Some people get things done because they make a plan, like I don't know if restorative is more problem solver, focus, and even a little bit of discipline, right?
Discipline there too,
there is just because we say you execute and you do things, how you do it, I think is really interesting. And I think but that's when we talk about how does those in the executing domain build trust, it's either because they make it a priority, they have a process for doing it, or they make a plan for it. And I think that's one of the things, my takeaways when I've coached people and leaders over time. I find execution is probably one of the easier ones to do change or to do something they don't do. So if I'm coaching someone and they're going, I need to build trust with my people. It's like, okay, get out your calendar and let's make a plan for it. Let's put it in your day timer, right? And it becomes an activity that they can cross off their list.
Yeah.
I think the other thing too is working with new leaders, right? And letting go of their daily execution. They're moving from doing the work to then leading the work, right? And that's hard for some of them to make that transition. And that trust is so important in that transition, because the best thing they can do is let their team do what they were doing before and let it go and not hold on to it. And
I've seen that too.
Oh man, it's tough because they feel like, especially if they've got high executing teams, they feel like they're not doing anything, right?
Yeah, and a lot of times they feel guilty about it. Oh, well, I can't just expect my people to do these things because I need to be working too. And I've had to walk through with leaders defining their roles differently so that they can let go of their previous job description because they used to measure productivity and success by getting these types of things done, and you almost have to like separate them from those old expectations and say, no, this is what your checklist looks like now that you're a leader. Or they will explain to me, this is what my checklist needs to look like, and try to help them forget their previous execution type metrics and redefine who they are as a leader and what productivity looks like. That's hard for a lot of leaders.
It's really hard.
Well, and I think Gallup does a good job of that. It's the manager. I was just looking at my phone too, because there's an article I'll send you all that was in Harvard Business Review. And it talks about leader of work versus leader of people. And that the new reshuffle and everything is you need to have more leader of people. And so if you used to own the work, including project plans and budgets, now you need to own the talent capacity, including personnel budgets. If you used to be a leader of work is responsible for project deliverables and business outcomes, a leader of people is responsible for employee engagement, career movement, and skills. So I think the question is, if you're in execution and you've been task oriented, your career, how do you build trust? And I think one of the things that someone said to me years ago, this was a professor I had, trust is about consistency over time. That's a real strength of execution. Is you can be trusted as a leader because you show up the same all the time. You will have your one-on-ones consistently over time. So there's a lot of those activities you can do to build trust because you do them consistently over time.
I think we've talked about this before too, but I think it's helpful for leaders to realize that you're building trust, good or bad, based on the habits that you let your people see. And that as a leader, if you're constantly canceling or rescheduling your one-on-ones, you're building trust in that way too, but it's not the kind of trust that you want to be building. They're going to trust that as their next one-on-one comes up, that you're going to move it again. And trust can be a two-way street that we have to be careful about as leaders.
Yeah, I just read this phrase somewhere. Someone was talking about this about housework, and I think trust is morally neutral.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
That is. Yeah. And I think it goes back to those 5 conversations that you have as a leader, and back to your example of being able to constantly, I always tell new leaders, 80% of your job is developing people. It's not doing the work, it's developing people. And I think so many times we get caught up in the minutia of, the meetings and getting things done. To your point, Micah, they're canceling meetings. But if you go back to the 5 conversations of the great 5 conversations as leaders, as coach, it's about having one of those 5 almost on a regular, consistent basis so that you are building that trust, whether it's a hallway conversation or quick text, or it's a dedicated time, 2 hours, but it's not just, that one performance plan every, once a year, which is right now people are in the midst of those conversations as they're talking through this year. So it's keeping those 5 conversations in your head as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's leveraging your strength, right? So if you're an achiever, making the 5 conversations a daily task, right? Or if you're at responsibility, so achiever and responsibility are in the top 5 frequent. So responsibility.
I was just thinking about these 2.
Do you take personal ownership, right? Psychological ownership of coaching conversations, right? So, and that I think puts it in the task framework for leaders to say, okay, even if I'm uncomfortable with it, I make it a priority, and it becomes part of my daily task to-do list.
I was just about to say that I think that right before you brought up those 2 examples, with the leaders that I work with, the ones that have the hardest time transitioning from individual contributor to leader are the high executing leaders, people with a lot of executing strengths. And those 2 in particular come to mind when an achiever is used to seeing visible outputs and visible deliverables, tangible evidence of their work or their productivity. And then they go into a role where you're trying to build trust, show compassion, create stability, and engender hope. It's like, how do you measure that? So the achievers have a hard time with that. But then also the responsibility where you take things on yourself and see them through, to extend that to somebody else and expect somebody else to do something that now you're not supposed to do yourself or willing to do yourself feels hard for people with high responsibility. And so it's interesting what H is saying. I couldn't agree more that if you have achiever and responsibility or a lot of executing strengths, if you can redefine your tasks, your task list with the 5 questions, or even just with these 4 needs of followers, and redefine what those tasks look like, and those are what you need to check off to say this is what good looks like, it'll make that transition to leadership easier.
Exactly. It looks like Josh has joined us, and he said he's joining late, but it sounds like H is bringing the domain focus again. Yes.
It's our last,
Always.
It's our last domain one, Josh. We're on the last domain of execution in terms of the 4 followers.
We'll change it up a little bit next time.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about compassion, which is the next, because I think trust and stability are easier when you have execution strengths. How do you do compassion when your strengths line execution?
Yeah.
I think that's
I think it goes to that. For me, it's responsibility. I have a responsibility to make sure I'm giving time to each person and understanding what they're going through and feeling what, just at least listening. I can't, maybe because my empathy is low, but my individualization is high, but understanding with my responsibility theme, how I can have that compassion and connect with them no matter what's going on. And I think it's that quick connect at the beginning of whether a team meeting or individual meeting. Let's talk about you. What's going on? What's on your heart tonight? What's on your heart today? How can I serve you better? That comes up to me in responsibility with that theme.
Yeah, I like that.
I bet you guys.
I've heard, go ahead, H.
Well, I'll give you a different spin. And I heard this a lot right before the pandemic and the early parts of pandemic. The difference between empathy and compassion. And I think the thing is, if you're listening and you listen with empathy, right, that's great. And people need that because they need to process their emotion. Compassion is empathy put to work.
Yeah.
So compassion is about doing something for that person because you feel their pains, their wants, their needs. And I think that's the real strength for those of us that have execution strengths, is to, one, make it, to your point, Dana, make it a consistent task that we're listening to our people, but then doing something about it. And I think that's one of the questions, and I can't remember if this is one of the 5, is when once they process their emotion or you're listening to them, it's like, so what do you need from me? Because if you know that as an executor, right, you're going to go do it. And I think that's showing compassion, empathy in action, compassion in action. And that's a subtle difference, but I really like that definition. Because there's one thing if I just go, I feel your pain.
Okay,
versus,
but then
let
what?
me do something about it. Yeah, exactly.
I've thought about this a lot over the last few months too, and hadn't actually arrived at any good conclusion as to how I would distinguish between those. So I'm really glad you brought that up. I had the other thought that in examples or conversations I've had with other people with high executing strengths or leaders with high executing strengths, it's interesting how often parenting comes up. So I know that I don't like comparing leadership to parenting too much, because it implies that your individual contributors are like kids, which isn't the case, but there definitely are some parallels. And many of these leaders with high executing strengths, when I bring up this idea that, have you ever had your kids ask you to come play Legos or play Candyland or something like that, and you have a hard time tearing yourself away from your task list, or you're sitting there and 2 minutes have passed and you're just like, let's speed this up so I can get back, because there's stuff that needs to get done. And it's crazy how often that resonates with these executors. And in that moment, like, they have this moment of clarity where they realize, like, you know what, that is not the way that I want to be. I want to be able to connect with my kids for 5, 10, 15 minutes and not worry about my to-do list. And often the strength that I bring in when they have it is belief. If we're talking about values and we can align their to-do list with their values and think about what do they value most, then the compassion starts to come through when they think about, is this in alignment? Is my to-do list or what I'm doing right now in alignment with my values? And if the answer is no, they can calibrate. And if it's yes, they can move forward. But I think that's a powerful one to leverage too, for compassion's sake, is belief.
And Joshua just asked about that, how we could use compassion in that aspect.
Nice. He and I are on the same wavelength.
There we go. Yeah.
Perfect.
I think too, with belief is telling the why, whether you're the leader, with belief, or your employee has belief, get them to explain their why. Agreed. Because there's where the compassion can come in, when you understand that why.
Yeah, and I also think belief to me was one of the ones that took me a while to get my head wrapped around it as an execution strength. I find though that when you have belief, you need to be conscious of what are the beliefs that are driving your work, are driving you to execute. Because I think a lot of times those beliefs are underlying. And so it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of changing from a leader of work to a leader of people. That has to be a value for you to really be conscious of it.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the things I tell folks with belief as a strength is and when I say conscious, I actually almost mean formal, and let's write them down.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's the intentionality, right? Every day, just saying, what can I use in my strengths to help me with this? Or who am I going to partner with on that? So now
it doesn't, sorry. One last thought about belief. It doesn't always have to be like deeply philosophical either. I heard a great story about a graphic designer who was on a project where somebody had created this wireframe of the website, and the designer caught wind of it and busts into this meeting and is pointing at some of the stuff on this wireframe, like, we can't put the button here. Like, she just got so passionate about the experience of our users will not be maximized or optimized if we don't move things around in these ways. And she had really high belief, and it was coming through in this passion for design, because for her, it was associated with the people that were coming in and connecting them to the right kind of experience that she wanted to be known for. And the passion and the belief, that alignment to what she was most, I keep using the word passion, but passionate about was design. And that's where it came through. And that's okay too. It's not philosophical.
You about 7 or 8 minutes left, but so should we move on to stability and what that would look like with the executing talents? When you think about stability, and one of the 4 things that followers need is stability. And so how would you say stability with executing talents? Or if you didn't have any, what could you use? And I think what I think about is consistency. And I think consistency, if you have consistency, then people know what to expect. You're not a loose cannon. You're not running around with emotional baggage that's going to make people feel unstable. But that you're giving a consistent message, and you're creating a consistent opportunity for them to communicate. And I think that's, I go to that one. I think arranger's also good. During that time, being able to arrange it's like touching all the, letting them, here's are, and this is good. This, in our case, it was the company's doing really good right now. Even though we're in this horrible situation, we can get through it because we've saved our money. It's given them all the things, little sayings, even, managing the good times, like in the bad times, things that you keep kind of giving them as headlines to keep them stable. And I think that's real important in building that kind of culture.
I think it goes back to my 3 Ps of making sure that you have people, process, that you have a plan for, a priority, or a process for people, right? Versus the task. And the other, so even deliberative, that's all of it, being conscious or intentional. I like your word better, Dana. To say, hey, I'm being deliberative right here because I care about the security, which is part of being stable, right? I want my team to feel secure. I want the business to be secure. So just because if you look at stability, it is about security and support. And I love this word, peace, right? Like restorative. You're problem solving, but just talking about why you're doing that, and not just from a task orientation, but what it means to people in the team.
Yeah. I think back to your point, Micah, the employees that you lead can feel if you're anxious, or if you're not feeling peaceful, as Age says, and so can your kids, right? They know something's up if you're not being stable about things. So
yeah, if I were able to look at the entire list of all 34 strengths and pick 3 that would be the best at creating stability, those are the 3 I would pick of all of them that happen to be in the executing. Would be consistency, because the consistency will think in repeatable rules and processes. So establishing expectations, and that this is the way it's going to be, and it's going to be fair for everybody. That's stability. Discipline is another one that we brought up that I think is so good at putting in place structure and frameworks and schedules. It's like that helps people feel like they know what to expect, and that there aren't going to be a lot of surprises. And then deliberative, that ability to kind of think about what could go wrong here. What are the obstacles that might destroy our peace and create upheaval in our environment? And if you can anticipate those things and resolve them before they come to light, it's like those 3 are probably the 3 that I would pick out of all 34 to create stability for people.
The thing I would want is, as a leader, right? Too often, do we create stability at the organizational or team level through structure, as opposed to think about you have to create stability at the individual level, which is about relationship. And that's but putting the same thing, right? Where you're creating structure, you're creating process, you're creating priority at the individual level,
not the organizational level.
And
that's cool.
It goes back to that communicate, which we started at the beginning with relationship building, the first domain.
Yeah. All right. So, I'm getting sucked in with you guys. I got to go. I have a phone call here in a minute, but this was great.
We'll see. Yep,
we'll talk to you guys next time.
H and I will close it out. So,
all right. Thank you.
Thank you, Micah. So H, let's talk about the last one, which is hope. How do you show hope with executing talents? Oh, and then we have a question from Joshua. I guess he said 2 of these are my bottom 5 and the others are my bottom 3rd. Guess I should think more about how I contribute to stability. But as we talked about before, right? You can, even if you aren't dominant in this domain, you have other talents you can use to help you in stability.
Yeah, like Josh, I think one of the things I do, I don't have any of those they're all in my bottom 10 except for arranger. And what I do for stability is I set the stage, with when I had employees or when I'm with clients, and say, here's the 3 things we're going to talk about today. Here's the agenda. Here's the flow. So even though it's not in my strength from an execution standpoint, relationship buildings are important to me. And I want to make sure that there is stability in the conversation, in the meeting, in the project. So that's kind of how I do it.
I love that, H. That's great.
I think one of the challenges is this one for me.
For hope.
If you're in execution, right? If your strengths are in execution, how do you establish hope? Because execution is focused on the here and now, right? We're focused on the task in front of us. And hope is all about the promise of a better tomorrow. And so how do you do that? Because they're kind of juxtaposed, right? And I think the thing of hope, I don't know. I don't have a great answer for it.
Yeah, I think it goes back to your planning, organizing, or planning. And I would think that arranger and the restorative is kind of what I go to, because the arranger is wanting to say, okay, we don't know what the future holds, but here's what we're going to do in the next 30 days.
Well, I mean, or make it. Yeah, go ahead.
Before, being able to kind of give a view of, even if there's not, what does that look like? How do you show hope in the moment?
Well, and I think that's, and not to say that executors would focus on I think the question becomes, to your earlier point about why don't you have hope? What's preventing that? And so then it becomes a problem, a task to solve. And I could see managers saying that. Or the other one is, what do I need? It gets down to, ultimately, as a leader in execution, and for some of these, especially, I think compassion and hope, it's, what do you need me to do? That's the big question, right? Because I can do something that creates hope because I'm going to do it. You can count on me to do it. You can trust me, and I have stability because I get stuff done. That plays to my strength. What do you need to do so that you feel better and you feel better about tomorrow? I think that's the real question to ask when you have execution.
Yeah. And even getting into that belief thing too, if you have execution, and how that shows up in that values-based But I love asking what you need, because people won't tell you what they need unless you ask them, what do you need? And it's almost like you were talking about in your facilitating teams. You'd say, here's what to expect today. Here's, at the end, you come back and say, did you get what you needed? Is there
Yes.
anything else? And I think it's making sure, because it's what has been left that has been not said. And how do you point to the hope if they're not asking for that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the challenge. That is a challenge, especially if you don't have any of those other things to bring along with your executing that would help with the futuristic or help with pointing up to a better tomorrow.
The other thing that I think provides hope is direction and guidance. And I think that's the thing with leaders who have execution strengths, is you will provide direction and guidance for the tasks at hand. You also need to think about, can I provide direction and guidance for how these people get along with their teams, for their career, for their development? I think those are also important too. You're comfortable providing direction, just make sure that it's, again, we're not being well-rounded, but as a team, people need direction about more than just the task at hand.
And I think that's why it's so cool in a team setting to get from them what they need, because they might not be able to verbalize it where somebody else on the team can, and help energize the team, as you say, making them well-rounded and point to hope. And sometimes that point of hope is looking back and saying, here's what we've been able to achieve in the past. We've gone through these challenges.
Good
Here,
point.
that's kind of what I found myself doing as we were going through COVID is, well, here's how we got through these other challenges. We don't know what this is going to look like. There's no roadmap for this, but here's what we do know. And we are going to get through this. And
that's a really excellent differentiation between strategic thinking, which is about thinking, right? So
right.
hey, we can think about what the future looks like, because
sure.
For execution strengths, it's all about doing and their experience. So then it's almost like you're saying, well, let me tell you about a time. So turn your previous tasks and what you've previously done into stories that create optimism and hope for others.
Absolutely. I like how you summarize that. That's great. Well, we are at the end of our time, and you are so, I didn't think you sounded too much like Kermit today, so you did good.
The drugs and caffeine.
So where are we going? So in the 2 weeks from now, I think it's the 18th, we're going to be back. H and Mike and I will be back, and we're going to be talking about the first 90 days of what it looks like. There's so many people that are transitioning, and we call it the Great Reshuffle right now. People are transitioning into new leadership roles. They're bringing on new leaders. What does that first 90 days look like? And what strengths we're going to use a few strengths at each session and talk through those and what you could use as you're going through a transition. So I love it. And Josh, thanks so much for your
thanks, Josh.
comments. I love them. He said, this has been super insightful for me today, working with many leaders high and executing when I'm not. Those are challenges. Yeah. So working through those aren't immediately easy. So thank you, Josh. That is true. There's a lot of people that come up from doing such a great job as executing to become leaders, and they have to let that go. So thank you for sharing that feedback. We look forward to seeing you guys on the 18th of April. We will talk about the next 90 days and what that could look like in your organization or for you as a leader as you transition. And once again, feel free to reach out to H, myself, or Micah if you have any questions or needs as we go through these topics. And we just love you guys being here. So thanks again.
All. Thanks, Dana.
Thank you, H. Okay.